Welcome to the session. It's a great panel that we're very blessed to have here with us today. And it takes off from David Zipper's presentation this morning, which really centered around disruption, right? That's really what we're talking about that's happening not only in our industry, but across other industries as well. Technology, e-commerce, the shifting expectations of customers and behaviors, all of these things are meaning that our business, our industries have to adapt and evolve. And while change isn't new, I think what is new is the change itself is changing in many respects. And what I mean by that is the degree and the scale and the speed of change is happening at a level that presents to us great new challenges and also opportunities. So our conversation is going to explore some of the disruptive forces that are driving change in other sectors, because we believe there's an awful lot that we can learn from that. And we'll focus on what the transit industry can learn from these different industries and situations, both here as well later today and even into tomorrow. So I'll have some questions for our panelists, but the goal really is to make this interactive. So begin to think in your minds about the questions that you might want to pose, because again, I think the benefit here is we've got a very intelligent, bright, experienced panel, but we've got very bright, experienced participants in the audience, so we want this to be interactive. But again, we're very privileged to have the panel with us. Let me introduce them, and I'm going to ask them just to raise their hands so you can identify them as I introduce them. Artemis Berry is Vice President of Member Engagement at the National Retail Federation. She leads the association's member experience and engagement strategy and oversees the digital, technology, cybersecurity, loss prevention, and marketing programs for its members. Robin Borsling is the Vice President of Infrastructure, Innovation, and Human Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. She leads NAM's policy and advocacy work on a wide range of issues, including transportation, infrastructure, and technology. Ms. Borsling also has worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation with a former really good friend of ours, Secretary Norm Mineta, and Secretary Mary Peters. Rob Morgan is the Vice President of Emerging Technologies at the American Bankers Association. Since joining the ABA in 2011, his work has promoted a policy environment that fosters innovation and gives banks the tools they need to advance and to modernize. He also served as the ABA's Director of Policy Research. Ed Mortimer, who is known to many of us, is the Vice President of Transportation and Infrastructure at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's a great friend and colleague. He leads the Americans for Transportation Mobility Coalition, ATM, of which APT is a very active member, which represents a group of business and labor leaders, transportation stakeholders, concerned citizens, all who believe we need to advocate for increased federal investment in transportation. And Dr. Martha Parham is Senior Vice President of Public Relations for the American Association of Community Colleges, where she leads the association's marketing, publications, media, and public relations functions. She also oversees its 21st Century Center, a program that's designed to advance the evolution and the influence of the nation's community colleges. So, let's begin by understanding the areas that each of you represent. So if you wouldn't mind, just share with us a brief overview of your industry and maybe a challenge or two that's facing the industry today. So with that, let's start here to my right immediately.
Okay.
And Robin, if you'd start.
Great, thank you, Paul. So the NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, is the largest industrial trade association in the U.S. We have about 13,000 members. We represent 12.75 million people who make things in America. And we are a large chunk of the economy, over $2 trillion we contribute to the economy on an annual basis. So the one thing, I was really excited when this opportunity was presented because I get to merge a lot of my favorite issue areas. So infrastructure and transportation with technology and people. And I think one commonality that we have in manufacturing with transit are jobs with purpose and meaning. And we have a lot of unfilled manufacturing jobs, about 500,000. And that is one of our biggest challenges that we face. And we look into the future, that number will not change, it will grow. And we continue to need more people to fill lots of different kinds of manufacturing jobs that we have available. And this is not a new issue by any stretch of the imagination, but as we move and evolve into what some of us call manufacturing 4.0, there are going to be new and different opportunities in manufacturing, and jobs are going to change. So I look forward to talking with all of you and hearing more about some of your questions and issues, but also the conversation with my fellow panelists, because we have a lot of commonalities and things that we are going to be facing together. And disruption in technology is certainly not new to manufacturing. We've been facing change for a very long time. It's how we're going to face it and how we're going to deal with what is presented to us and grow. Manufacturing is a wonderful sector, and like I said, we're a big chunk of the economy, and for the United States to be successful, we have to have a successful manufacturing economy.
Great. Ed?
Sure. Ed Mortimer with U.S. Chamber. Pleasure to be here. Paul, thanks for the invitation. I, too, was excited about this opportunity. You hear a lot of the negativity in Washington, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to be had here. And the American business community, who we represent at the Chamber, we have 3.5 million members. The state and local chambers that I know many of the transit agencies have worked on locally on issues. We really see an opportunity with divided government to get some things done. So our business community really looks at infrastructure as the backbone of the economy. We are very excited to get tax reform done, but really if we don't follow up with infrastructure modernization, we're really going to miss an opportunity to have long-term sustained economic growth. So within this disruptive time, we have an opportunity to use innovation and technology to really solve these problems that we've been dealing with for many, many years. And so we really see this as a once-in-a-generational opportunity to kind of set the course at the federal level. State and local governments have been doing their job for the last several years. We just had very successful ballot initiatives where I believe in the transit sector, 80% of the ballot initiatives were approved. I think it's 78 overall in infrastructure. Fought back a very negative opportunity in California to repeal the gas tax. And so I think we have a real good opportunity here to get something done at the federal level. And we need to make sure that as we do this, knowing that your industry is going through a lot of disruption and change with different uses of transit, and I'm sure you've talked about this here in DC, these scooters now are everywhere. I even see professional people doing it. So how transit agencies deal with that, it's going to be really interesting to see how that moving forward. The business community wants to be part of the solution. We've been fixing potholes. We've been barely keeping transit agencies running, but we need to modernize it, and we see this as an opportunity to do it. So I'm glad to be here. I've been in the chairs that you guys were in the 10 years I was at the engineering firm, and I want to recognize my dear colleague Joe Alexander, who I worked with many years. We got Dulles Rail for phase 1 done, and hopefully going to get phase 2 done soon. So real excited to be here and look forward to this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Ed, very much. Rob?
Well, thanks again for having me. This is great to be here. And I'm Rob Morgan. I'm with the American Bankers Association. We represent our nation's 5,500 banks, everyone from the largest international banks down to the smallest community banks. So really, the whole spread there. We often joke internally that my role at ABA is the token millennial. I'm here to tell everyone what apps I'm using this week. But I run our emerging technologies team, which is focused on both the policy side of how are new technologies changing assumptions in a really heavily regulated industry, but also looking at how do we connect our members and our banks with the companies that are innovating to help bring some of those new innovations to customers. And I think that's my answer for challenges as well. We're in an industry that's technology is changing very quickly, much like transit. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Artemis?
Hi, everyone. Artemis Berry with the National Retail Federation. We represent about 18,000 retail members, as well as the thousands of technology companies that serve the retail industry, so large and small. A lot of challenges in common with our friends at the Manufacturers Group and the Chamber in terms of economic pressures and just the competitive environment for our brands. I would rather not refer to it as the Amazon effect because it's way beyond Amazon in a global world, but the competitive pressures are tough. The talent shortages in some ways are another kind of area that we're looking at. We're talking to a lot of workforce groups to kind of power the retail jobs that power our economy. And one of the things that I pride myself in, and I came from, I'm one of the other token millennials, came from the startup industry and all things e-commerce, and how that is just changing experiencing retail every single day and something that each one of you know and understand. It's not as complex. Retail is something every one of you touch every single day. It's the barometer of the health of our economy, or one of several key barometers. So it's proud to represent the group, and there are from the local retailers to the largest brands in the world are in our portfolio.
Hi everyone, I'm Martha Parham, and I am proud to represent the nation's 1,103 community colleges. And I love going last because I get to hear that we're all facing the exact same things. So community colleges right now are, we serve 12 million students a year. So it is collectively the largest system of higher education in the world, actually. It is also the least funded, as you can imagine. I'm sure none of you have those worries with budgets or anything. We're seeing a lot of disinvestment, we call it, from states in terms of investing, in terms of funding community college education. But at the same time, we're really encouraged because we're working with our partners in workforce to fill the skills gap that the folks in manufacturing are talking about. We're talking about training for higher careers in retail. We are the provider of education for the majority of minority and first-generation students in the United States. So we like to think of ourselves as the on-ramp to the middle class, and so we're constantly adapting to the challenges and the changes that come our way. But one thing I think two people mentioned, but we didn't really talk about it, that we're really facing is the change of our students. This new generation of students view education very differently. So when you have, no offense, when you have an organization that's filled with boomers, right, that are kind of ready to retire, they're not ready to change how they're teaching, and yet you have a whole generation, two actually, generations of students that learn very differently than we did. So that's another, you say token millennial, but it's really an important, I think, thing to call out as a change driver in all of our respective industries.
Perfect segue. You touched on the students, which are your customers, right, for the community colleges. Let me then phrase a question here to our panel around customers, because that's what matters to us as well, and customer preferences. So let's look at the customer experience as a disruptor. We know it's hard to keep up. It isn't in transit. But just as we respond to one set of customers' needs and the wants and expectations, it seems as though technology is changing that, and our customers' expectations change once again. Customers are looking for a tailored, personalized experience with more options, more convenience, more value. So to our panel, I'd like to pose that to any one of you that might want to respond to that, how your industry is responding to the changing customer preferences.
I can take a stab. So we're in our Super Bowl with the holiday season kind of upon us. I think for us, we have to respond to consumer expectations, very similar to many of you in the room, very quickly, or else there's significant hits on weekends like this past weekend for holiday sales, for example. So if I want to just bring up one or two examples, if you think of just the need for speed in terms of product delivery, that's something that our industry has been working to solve for years. There's a million terms for it in our world. So retailers, so if you think of some of the largest brands in the world, big box brands, they're changing their store setups. They're setting to allow for buy online, pick up in store. They're partnering with delivery groups and services to get the product in your hand within an hour. They're partnering with technology companies to allow for mobile alerts to message. And again, many of you know this because you use these services or members of your family do. So you can't do that in a silo. You can't do that with a retail organizational structure from 20 years ago. So it's a constant state of evolution. Everything down to the financial models of how retail store associates are compensated has been different. Where you have to think about when someone is bringing back a return from a .com, how that impacts their financial kind of accounting, and how do you incentivize the store, and when things things like a store associate sales, how they selected hours, and some retailers still, aren't all the way there, but how a store associate gets to select their hours in some brands was tied to the number of sales they had, and returns can completely mess that up, and it's the .com versus the retail store. So if you think of delivery as just one thing, something each one of you deal with, the last minute gift you need, everything is changing for us in terms of our partnerships, what technology means for our organizations, how massive our technology teams are now in retail organizations, the data that they're looking at, so hiring things like data scientists, and there's some organizations that have massive data science teams now to go through that data, big or little, or however you want to term it, it's just data. How they're investing in tech in terms of acquiring technology companies to kind of get that talent in and build the services that consumers, every one of us, kind of demand. And if not, there's a competitor, right around the corner, a lot of startups that are disrupting the traditional space. And so if you just break it down into product delivery, there's one, and we have probably 50 of those type of things that retail deals with every day.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think the technology piece is a really key component, and I think partnerships are a key component of that as well. I mean, we've seen technology shifts happen before. We saw it with sort of the .com era and people moving to the web for services. And I think what's really different this time is it's this thing, right? It's the fact that we all have what a few years ago would be considered a supercomputer in our pockets. And that really changes the way we all connect with all of the products and services we consume. How many of you here hit a button on your phone to get here today, right? Things like that. Or even, you turn to your phone first thing in the morning for the news instead of flipping on the TV. So from our perspective in banking, it's really easy to look at that and think that it changes everything. And that's, I think, been the tendency, right? It's disruption and everything is going to be different tomorrow. So I think mobile has changed a lot of things. Customers are always connected now. But in our mind, there are really a few key factors that have changed. I think you hit the nail on the head with the first one. It's expectations, right? Customer expectations now aren't necessarily set by closest competitors in the banking space. We often say that a bank's competitor is no longer the branch down the street, but it's a customer's last best experience. So if that was Amazon or Google or whatever it is, and these companies are setting the bar for how you get services across everything. The second piece that we think is really changing things is the need for a physical presence, right? It used to be that a location on the corner of Main Street was the most valuable way to connect with customers, that sort of physical presence in a community. But now, space on the home screen is much more valuable, right? And from a banking side, technology has always been a part of banking, but it's always had to go through those that had the direct customer connections. Because companies are able to now directly connect with customers on their phones, we're seeing a lot more of these sort of startups go directly to customers. And I think the scooter example is another sort of good piece there. The last thing that I think is really changing from our view is data and the importance that data plays. Banking has always been a relationship business, and it used to be that you got to know customers when they'd walk into a branch, and you'd have a conversation and ask how the kids are. And that's not how it is anymore. As more and more transactions become digital, mobile, you need to learn about your customers the same way you used to, but through some of that data. So I think there is a lot changing, but just as much isn't changing. From our perspective, the core business really still is the same. And we're still talking in banking about taking deposits, making loans. Ultimately, it's the same service that people are looking for, and it's really the delivery channel that's been different. So from our perspective, it's about meeting customers where they are and giving them that same service that they've always come to us for on their terms, in this case, mobily.
I would just say, to Artemis, Rob talked a lot about the customer expectation. There's also speed, obviously, is critical, but it's also how do we develop the workforce to actually deliver those products. So, squeezing out efficiency and knowing that we have 3.7% unemployment. So that's where our community colleges come in, where, this illusion that everybody has to get a 4-year liberal arts degree is a misnomer. We need to provide those skill sets and then figure out how do we do that. How do we get these folks the skills they need to do the 21st century work? So it's a real pressure on the American business community to find the skilled workforce to do that. And many of you in communities that know that you create either a smart city or a livable community, which is what Rob's generation wants, the millennials, they are looking for that. Those are the communities that are attracting these folks, these high-skilled workers. So American business is looking at how do we attract those folks to our community to do the jobs that we need. And so those communities that are adapting to that, and I always think of like Columbus, Charlotte, Nashville, starting to make some inroads there. They're attracting these folks. And these are towns that have totally transformed from what they were 50 years ago. So American business is also being forced to transform in that way. And obviously those businesses that are able to jump on that are going to be successful. The ones that don't, and you look at Sears Roebuck, and what's happened to them, that was an iconic company, but they did not adapt to a lot of these changes that we're talking about here, and now we're going to lose them. So the businesses that are going to succeed are the ones that are adapting, but I think you need to think about customer expectation means how do you actually get that. And obviously the supply chain is a big part of it, but it's actually to Robin's members in manufacturing. Where do we find the men and women to do that work? And how do we get them those skills? That's where the community colleges come in. So it all kind of ties together. And Rob, I think you made the point earlier. How do we tie all that together to make it work? That's really our challenge moving forward. It's not just your industry or any of our industries individually. We all have to kind of coordinate together to make this all work.
And if I could add in, 20 years ago, I would say manufacturers were probably not viewed as customers of community colleges. But because of the skills gap and the crisis that the manufacturing sector is facing in finding these workers, the partnerships that have evolved and developed with the community college systems around the country have been absolutely critical, and really a testament also to the community college system for reaching out and working with employers and understanding that they're going to have to tailor their curriculums to meet what employers actually need.
Yeah, I mean, but that's what the community college does, right? We are built on the notion that we will adapt to the community around us to serve them. So adaptation to new things is nothing new for our community colleges. What we're seeing, this is kind of flipping a little bit on the script here, is that our community, we serve the majority of community college presidents in the United States, and what we're seeing from, what we're hearing from them is, as CEOs, as leaders in the sector, technology and data security is becoming a much bigger issue in terms of not only time but knowledge and money. I mean, student data is critical to keep secure, and so community colleges that are already underfunded, you know, if they're hit with a big data breach and have to pay for that, you know, that really factors in. So those are some things that our leaders are talking about that they didn't have to talk about even 10 years ago.
And it's no longer an IT function. It's
a college-wide function.
It's the CEO at the top making the decision.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really important to understand in all of these big operational changes, is you can't segment it and say, well, this is for the IT department or just the legal department. It's everybody.
Rob, I heard you say something a moment ago. With all the changes around the whole banking industry, you came back to saying, well, the core services are kind of the same. We give loans, we take deposits, et cetera, but we've got to do some other things. I wonder if you could just maybe expand on that a little bit, and I'm going to look to our audience here if they want to pick up on that theme, because I think that has a great relationship to our transit world in terms of basic core services that we provide and perhaps what's around those that have to be a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, some of those core services really haven't changed. The structure of loans, the structure of what deposits are haven't changed. We've seen innovations around the edge in some of those. But what's really changing is how people engage with those brands and how they consume them. There's a really good example. One of the strategy professors who's currently at Wharton is writing a book on how mobile and how this type of technology has changed the way people connect with brands. His name's Nikolai Sigelko. It's this idea called connected strategy. The idea is that brands are actually now connecting more often in really small ways with customers, where it used to be that you'd typically connect with a brand every once in a while for a big purchase. Really good example is something I think we all think of as pretty analog, company like Nike, right? Nike sells shoes. I buy a new pair of shoes every year and a half when I run through a pair of running shoes, and I engage with the brand then, and probably not even them. I go to the local Foot Locker and buy that pair of shoes. The question is, how are these companies creating more and more little interactions that create brand loyalty, create the ability, and create value for customers that they'll pay more for? You know, in Nike's case, it's putting sensors in your shoes so you open an app every time you go for a run and actually start coaching you. Now, I'm not buying a pair of Nike shoes, Nike's helping me run that marathon. That's something I'm willing to pay a little bit more for. We see a lot of that in the banking space with helping people manage their finances, things like that. But I think people are turning more and more to the overall experience than just the core product. So.
All right, I'd like to turn to another question for the panel as well. In the meantime, we've got microphones here and here, so don't be bashful in the audience. We're ready for your questions as well. But let me turn to innovation, because I think this is a question, again, that many of us are dealing with within our own organizations, and that is, give us your take on what it takes to create a culture that supports innovation and encourages individuals who are internal entrepreneurs who drive the change, see opportunities, take on the tough challenges. You know, we're oftentimes kind of hemmed in, perhaps, with what has been done and how things are being done. You know, I think we all would agree that innovation can bring excellent value to organizations and businesses as change agents and creative thinkers. But tell us a little bit about your take from your industry side of how we can encourage more innovation on the part of our people, our employees.
I think you have to set an environment that allows people to fail. So you have to be confident enough in your own abilities as a leader, whether you're the CEO or whether you're leading from where you sit, it doesn't matter. You have to be confident enough in your own skills and your own team to be able to say, we're going to try this. It may work, it may not work, but if you let people fail and give them where they're not fear of their job or they're not in fear of being seen differently, I think it really leads to a more, people are more willing to try things. It sounds really simple, but I think what we find is you get stuck in your silos and your bureaucracy, and in our case, we have elected boards or appointed boards. We have governors we have to deal with, and parents and students and community members, and so, you know, everyone gets into their safe place, which safe or not in your comfort zone is not really an innovative place to be.
I'd also add, we've been a part of telling the story about manufacturing, and even though the NAM is known as an advocacy organization here in Washington, we've had to be much more outward facing and explaining to parents and teachers what manufacturing is all about and telling that innovation story, because the impressions that some people have of manufacturing, they're thinking about where their grandfather may have worked during World War II, and it's very different. And talking about connected shop floors, talking about the industrial Internet of Things, and that people who work on production lines are not machines, they're people, and they have opportunity, and they can grow, and they can be educated and contribute to the business in a very meaningful way.
Right. I think from our perspective, so, you know, the American business community, 85% of all businesses in America are small business. We just had Small Business Saturday. So allowing the small businesses to flourish. And I think your point was very much sometimes they fail, but that's okay. You know, you look at the history, look at Steve Jobs, you know, you look at it through history. People have failed in business and have succeeded. So we have to create a regulatory environment where it's okay to try something out, get some capital, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but the market will take care of that. So providing that environment to do it, you know, all these startup companies, they all first, they say they don't want to deal with Washington. And then they realize that if they don't deal with Washington, Washington's going to deal with them. Yeah. So then people like Facebook and Twitter, they've all got government affairs shops now. They thought they could just ignore Washington, Elon Musk, right? We don't need DC, they can't do anything to us. We don't care about them. Well, you probably ought to care about them because they care about you. So understanding that dynamic and relationship, but really creating an environment where the failure can happen. And it's okay, the free market can handle that. But that's what made this economy so great, is that we allowed companies to try new things, to create new industries. The whole .com industry came out of nowhere, all right? But we let that happen. There were a lot of people, then it kind of fizzled out, and now we're left with some core companies in that area. But we continue to innovate and grow, and that's kind of been the strength of the free enterprise system, is allowing that to happen. And I think as long as we have government policies, and we do at this point, to allow that to happen, we're going to be okay.
Yeah, and I'd just echo a lot of what's been said. I think that need to fail that's been mentioned is an important part. From sort of a personal anecdote, at the ABA, we've dealt with this challenge as well, and we're a 140-plus-year-old institution that's, trade associations aren't always known for changing the most rapidly. But as our new CEO came in about 3 years ago, he really made this sort of technical innovation question a key one for us, and he brought together a group of staff, breaking down silos really from across the association, told us to think broadly about what we could do, not only in the area we'd traditionally worked in policy, but also how do we help our members innovate, and gave us room to fail, gave us room to try crazy things. And ultimately what we did was look at how some of the leaders in our industry were innovating and how we could help bring that to the rest of the industry and sort of replicate some of those pieces. So, breaking down silos and creating that sort of collaboration, a problem that one business unit might see, that another business unit might have something to solve, where if you're not talking, you'll never see that. And we certainly saw a lot of that through our process.
I think we've got a question. If you'd identify yourself and an affiliation for the benefit of the panel especially.
Hi, my name is Doug Licato, Lansing, Michigan, Keppel Area Transit Authority. One holistic item I see that all of you guys have mentioned, and it starts in high school or even before high school, and that's the speed of either to education or to the resources you need. So what are we doing? I see the high schools, more now getting college classes available to high school students so they can get, the information they need so they can get to their careers faster. So what that does is gives them the resources, but then what's, I guess, we need to think about breaking the mold of big companies, the red tape that slows everything down. And I think each of you may agree that the red tape and all this policies and that have been in place sort of keep things safe now need to be broken in order to meet the needs of every industry that's trying to be successful. And the small companies, like the retailers and all that, 85% you mentioned, they don't have all this red tape in place. And that's why they're very agile in what they want to do. Right. So my question is, what can we do to assist in breaking the mold and increasing the speed and getting those students the resources they need faster so they can fill those positions in manufacturing and in retail and be there for the banking industry to support them?
I guess I'll take that one. I think initially I can let you know that throughout the United States we have what we call dual enrollment, which is a widely popular program where high school students take community college classes while they're still in high school. So you may have heard there's many high school graduates that also graduate with their associate's degree or some sort of certificate when they graduate from high school. So that is a program that many community colleges do. It's not new. I might get a call once a week from a reporter saying, my high school's doing this, and they think it's this brand new innovative thing. It's not. It's been going on for years, and it's a really great way to introduce high school students to these resources that they have and kind of speed them to the workforce, if you will. The second thing I'll note, and my colleague touched on it a few minutes ago, is we are in this unprecedented state of growth between community colleges and manufacturers and local businesses. And what we're finding is it's not just manufacturing, it is banking, it is insurance, it is all kinds of industries, retail, hotel management, any industry you can think of. We've been very fortunate that despite who's in the White House, it hasn't seemed to matter. They've all reached out to community colleges in the last, say, 20 years to work with community colleges to help that skills gap. So we have programs for students. One of my favorite examples is in South Carolina. We have one with BMW where they provide the cars equipment, the mechanics tools, the technology that you need to diagnose the car problems. They provide new model year cars to the program so that students can learn on actual BMWs. They get, they have a class of students that graduate every year, that graduate with a certificate. They're certified BMW mechanics, and now BMW has a wealth of employees to draw from. So that's just, I can sit here all day and list these types of programs.
Yeah, and if I could chime in on that too. And one thing that we've done as an association is lead something called Manufacturing Day. And it's every first Friday in October, and it's a thing that people were doing as one-offs throughout the year, opening their doors to schools, civic organizations, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it. And we found that this was a successful way to get people to see and touch modern manufacturing. And we decided that it was going to be more organized several years ago, and it's now a thing. And it's something that we plan throughout the year, that we do as a concerted effort. And it doesn't have to be just on October 5th, as it was this year. But I would highly encourage the transit sector to go beyond National Transportation Week and go and find a day that you all work together, or a month, where you are going out to educators, to civic organizations, and showing what you have and the opportunities that are available in transit, because they are tremendous. And like I said earlier, they are jobs with meaning and purpose. And I think that's really important as we talk about the future worker.
Great comment. Doug, I know you've been waiting.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for your contributions this morning. My name is Doug Kelsey. I'm the General Manager CEO in Portland, Oregon. Question for you. For each of your different sectors, and I used to work in the private sector as well, what was the tipping point when your association and your industry realized you were under siege? And how did you get to strategy when the disruptors were at the door?
Wow.
Well, happy
Really
to
think about that.
Yeah, happy to take a first swing at that. I think in the banking side, it's somewhat unique. After 2010, a lot of our industry was dealing with historic regulatory reform and tremendous burden associated with that. And I think as we saw a lot of that come into play, clearly a lot of banks' efforts were focused on that piece, which we saw a lot of direct-to-consumer brands begin to come out, start taking an increasing share. So I think there was sort of a realization moment when people sort of came up for a breath of air after implementing all sorts of new compliance programs, things like that, and looked at what had been done over recent years and how regulations might have pushed customers outside of that system and into some of these alternative apps. But what I would say is the more we've seen that develop, the more we've seen it move from a competitive sort of being disrupted landscape to a collaborative one. And we've seen a lot of these same companies that started off life trying to compete with the banks are now looking to be the best partners. So, as banks started to get involved, I think beginning discussions with some of those so-called disruptors and looking at what they're doing, what problems they're solving, really led to a response in and of itself where the banks are now see these more as opportunities and bring them in and are working to partner to bring sort of the institutional experience together with the tech experience and the user experience that have been built out on the startup side.
Any others wanted to chime in on that one?
Yeah, if I could chime in too. I think this is going to sound very weird coming from a Washington-based advocacy organization. Not all the answers are in Washington, D.C. And I think that was certainly a tipping point for the NAM. Workforce had consistently ranked as a top manufacturing business challenge. And Washington can't fix that. There are certain things that Washington can do to help ameliorate the challenges, but that our businesses were going to have to come together and make the introductions and the conversations with community colleges, with jobs-based organizations, and start getting everyone to be on the same page.
Great. Artemis, did you have a comment?
Just a couple things. So from the disruption from in the industry overall, a tipping point for us there was, I would say, probably in the 2009, 2010 period. So kind of as as we're dealing with the recession, as new mobile technology is coming out, I think that's when things like e-commerce stop being the redheaded stepchild in like many ways. So that's one tipping point. From the workforce side, I think we started seeing it because of the digital component when, you know, Wall Street, the numbers being reported to Wall Street started changing. And there were some very big retailers that announced that probably 7 or 8 years ago. That started changing, and organizational kind of titles started changing at the C-suite for us. So those are like two different kind of tipping points, but we started seeing both of those were very impactful and kind of around the same timeline. But I feel like we have a tipping point every year right now.
And I don't know that we have a specific tipping point, because I feel like part of our multiple missions is to adapt to what our community needs are. But I think I have the privilege to work for a community college that was kind of the at the forefront of distance education, or what, you know, now we have online classes. But they were literally mailing like VHS and doing TV college. You know, they were like the first in the nation to do that. They were originally built in the 70s as the College Without Walls. So I think that was kind of a tipping point for us as well, in terms of seeing that there are different modalities of learning that can happen, that don't have to happen in a classroom. So that was a big kind of shift for us.
David.
So each of you has mentioned, as we move through the disruptive process that we're all in the midst of, that we need to be willing to embrace failure, and that failure is part of growth. But as a parent of a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old, I have children who have been raised in a generation where they've been protected in some ways and sheltered from failure. So are you seeing any of that as a challenge as the new workforce emerges, and we're dependent on that new workforce to be willing to take risk when in many ways they've grown up to be risk averse, or not understanding that you can't understand success without understanding failure? And if you are seeing that, are there any tools or suggestions as to how we can embrace that in our industry and understand it? Because it's different than the way I grew up. There were winners and losers when I was raised. We kept score at sporting events, so it's just a different,
So all of us are listening on this one as parents, right?
I'll start with that. I could go a lot of places with that. That's a great. So I'll start with saying I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. I understand where you're coming from by saying we protect them. We still let them fail. We just tell them they didn't fail, right? We still let them fail. We just say it's okay, right? Where back in some of our days, there was a price to pay. When you failed, there was a consequence to it, right? So I would say, in my opinion, millennials are willing to fail. They're just not willing to for a consequence of that. A challenge from the American business community is, so if you're a publicly traded company and you're a CEO, how much innovation do you really want to do knowing that you have 2 bad quarters? You're probably going to lose your job. So that's a challenge for bigger companies that are publicly traded. That being said, you know, if you don't evolve, you're not going to survive. And again, my Sears example of that is something. So one, you have to have confidence in leadership to be able to make these types of decisions. You got to listen to your team. I think we talked about that. You know, there was a day that everything was process oriented and you never stepped above you got to break that silo mentality down. And I know I get some of my best advice from our youngest employees. I may not always go with all of it, but there's always something in there that I say, some of that makes sense. So you have to be open to the conversation. So my suggestion is that younger people are willing to fail. There needs to be a consequence, but maybe not as harsh as some of us had in our younger years. But encouraging them to push that envelope and not be satisfied with just the status quo. Young people that I know, that they want to push that envelope. And so we have to encourage that, letting them understand, though, there are certain consequences. You know, you can't just do anything you want. There are certain consequences, maybe not as harsh as we had, but, you know, and then, you know, this is something I don't know how we deal with, but the whole Wall Street mentality of the 2 quarter bad quarters and you're out. You know, we have activist investors at a lot of these companies that love to go after companies that try things and fail in the short term. So CEOs aren't necessarily rewarded anymore for long-term thinking.
Or risk.
It's a big problem in American business. I don't have the answer to that, but we know it's a challenge.
I think one thing that's also important, and I'm a parent of a 7 and an 11-year-old, and so I think about this frequently, but also is to tell kids they're going to have to move and they're going to have to be mobile. And a lot of the jobs that we have in the manufacturing sector, it's about getting the people to the jobs. And so I grew up in a small town in southern New England. There aren't a whole lot of opportunities there. I had to move to go where the opportunities lay and where the interests are that I have personally. And that I think we're going to have to tell kids, you can't always go home and live in the basement or whatever it may be, but that you're going to have to think about a lot of other places in the country or even the world and pursue your interests that way.
Natalie?
Hi, I'm Natalie Cornell with LTK Engineering out of Philadelphia. Kind of a big picture question for you that builds a little bit on Doug's. He asked about tipping points. I'm curious about lessons learned. So the tipping points you hit, the challenges you've found, what can we learn from your industries? And I know every one of you is involved with transportation somehow, right? You have to get to work. Your kids have to get to school. You have to go shopping. You got to get to the doctor. So in some way or another, you all interact with the transportation system that we help run or build. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what one thing would you change in what we do that would help make your lives easier based on some of the lessons you've learned in your industries?
I'm thinking
big
too,
question.
Natalie, that's a tough one.
I'll speak to, I think, what American business and a lot of people look for from public transit. It all comes down to reliability, right?
Certainty.
Certainty, reliability. Not necessarily that it has to be the fastest, but you know that when either the train or the bus is there, it's going to be there. And I know that's a challenge for all of you, right? Because you're dealing with tight budgets. You're dealing with some of these systems that are older, that haven't been maintained. But what we're seeing is that younger people, and I hate to, but just look here in district with WMATA, is a lot of people are going away from it not because they don't want to use it. It's that there's not a predictability to it all the time, and that there are now other entrants into the market, rideshare, scooters, that are filling that void. So, reliability and predictability are key to the success of public transit. And I think all of our industries, that is what our customers expect. They know what they're going to get, and they know when they're going to get it. So while we've talked a lot today about speed, it's that certainty, I think that's actually maybe almost more important and something we forget. And because that certainty means they can count on you. If they can't count on you, they're going to go somewhere else.
Yeah, one lesson I guess share from the banking side, and I hinted at this in my earlier answer, is the value of looking at some of these companies you may think of as disruptors as potential partners. Again, in the banking side, there were these companies that were going to go put the banks out of business that are now some of the best technology partners. So look at what each side does really well. What strengths do you bring to the table? What strengths do some of these startups bring to the table? And then in the banking side, the banks know the business really well, know the markets well, and know their customers really well. But there were some of these technology-focused companies that were building great user experiences. And what we've seen is when you actually can work together with some of those pieces, you get the best of both worlds. And that those partnerships can be really valuable rather than spending time sort of fighting them.
Just to add on from the external partnerships, if there's a lot of, in retail, there's been a lot of success with little incubators within your own organization. So again, they have different names. So from like traditional R&D types of groups, like Thinking Ahead, to innovation labs that are built within an organization. If you just start really small and just have teams that are thinking differently, Rob mentioned like cross-functional teams being really important, looking at kind of the demographics in the room, just a number of factors to see how can you disrupt yourself with just a small group, a kind of a 2 pizza like size team, and try to just break something a little bit.
I think from our perspective, you have to have the ability to really look at yourself honestly, which just sounds easy, but it's really, really hard to do. We, a few years ago, after some criticism, the community colleges are known for open access. We like to say we accept the top 100% of students in the United States. But that open access, which we are incredibly proud of and will continue to advocate for strongly, was met with, yeah, but a lot of your students don't graduate. And we sat down, took a really hard look at our completion rates. Not all of our students graduate. Some get certificates. Some take one class and get promoted at work, and that's their success story. So it's really hard to define, but we took a long look and said, you know what, you're right. Our students aren't completing in the way they're supposed to complete. And so since then, we've been working toward that. Now, I have to tell you, just recently, we are hearing from, we've forgotten about lifelong education. So the pendulum does swing back and forth, but I think being able to listen to what your constituents or members are looking for and really take to heart and be able to take that hard look at what your industry is doing or not doing and do it honestly, I think has been really important for us.
Paul.
Thank you. Good morning. Great panel. I'm Paul Comfort with Trapeze and the Transit Unplugged podcast, and I write for Axios News Service on shared autonomous vehicles. So I have a question for you, Robert, on the banking industry and the analogous kind of innovations between us. So one of the big technological disruptors coming to the transit industry is shared autonomous vehicles, buses with no drivers. And a big concern we're hearing out in the general public and even in our own employee base is a great loss of jobs that are possibly going to come. Are drivers and mechanics going to lose their jobs, and dispatchers, because these new buses will come with no drivers? And I've just been thinking recently about the banking industry. You all introduced ATMs, automated tellers, right? And now handheld devices. Have you seen a major loss of teller jobs as a result of that, or has it allowed you to redeploy those resources and open up new branches and serve new areas? Could you give us something on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think this is one of those areas that's always really touchy, right? AI innovation, does it just mean job loss, right? And I completely agree with your point there, is that most often it really doesn't, right? When the ATMs were rolled out, people were scared it was the end of the teller. I've heard examples from bankers who were in management at the time where there was this box with sort of a cover over it, and you weren't allowed to tell anyone what it was because everyone would get really scared, right? The banking industry, jobs have grown sort of exponentially from then. And I think what we typically see as technology comes in, it can replace some of the sort of the repetitive tasks. It can replace some of the parts of your day you don't like doing and free people up to do more interesting work, right? So in the banking side, we see a lot of that with talking about AI for things like compliance today. There are a lot of implementations of AI in anti-money laundering and compliance rules associated with that. You're not putting people out of a job in most cases. What you're doing is freeing people up from going through very repetitive tasks to actually investigating the few things that really matter. And I think the other great example of this is Excel, right? When Excel came out, everyone was worried that the accountants are done, right? Can you imagine an accountant today that would do their job without Excel? So most often we really see these technologies as enablers, not replacement.
All right, let me ask this question of our panel. The disrupted versus the disruptor. So as some disrupted industries work to reinvent themselves, they're becoming disruptors themselves, or in some cases being disrupted. So we'd like to explore that later on in this session in public transit, but I'd like to get your take on that. Let me use the community college as kind of the maybe a good example of that. Historically, community colleges have been the disruptor of higher education in some respects, right? So what are the market forces that you're seeing where either your industry is a disruptor or in fact is it being disrupting itself? So you can go either way, disruptor, being disrupted. Just like to get your take on that from your industry perspective.
Well, I don't know that I would classify it as disrupted. I think we are adaptable. I think that we are, one of the great examples is a few years ago, we were tasked with extending an arm to our manufacturing partners and saying, we need to close the skills gap. And so we were able to, relatively quickly, nothing moves quickly in the public world, as we all know, but relatively quickly work to establish these public partnerships with private companies and manufacturing facilities to where we were really providing them with a skilled labor force, and we were also being provided with students and equipment and curriculum. So I think we're able to that was a disruptor just because it had never been done before. They were looking at internship programs the way they do it in Europe and all different kinds of things, but it's sometimes it's just as simple as reaching out to others that are in the same predicament and saying, you have a need and we have these students that need a job, so how do we make this work together?
To bring it back to Washington too, we had to make sure that Congress understood these changes. And so when we were working on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act or the Perkins Career and Technical Education Bill, that worlds that they may have known 10 years ago were very different, and that these bills and funding opportunities had to be approached very differently. And they had to give some more leeway to community colleges, to four-year institutions, and to businesses to solve some of these challenges together and not have the heavy hand dictate what exactly had to be done.
And that's not as easy as it sounds, right? I mean, I think those are the things that we've learned. Right now, there's a proposal to give Pell Grants to students that are taking these short-term, what we call career and technical education programs, which are these, learn how to become a plumber, or we have commercial truck drivers, slot machine repair technicians. I could go on and on. But they're not eligible for federal Pell Grants. So there was language put out there saying, hey, let's make we need workers. We need trained U.S. workers, so why not give them the Pell Grants? But nope, we can't do that, because for every one of us that wants a Pell Grant for that student, there's a four-year university saying, but wait a minute, that means they won't have a Pell Grant when they want to come to my college. So it's not as easy as it sounds to kind of disrupt the status quo in DC or at a public institution, regardless of whether it's a community college or any other. So I don't know, I'd like to hear from our private industry folks. Might be a little easier for them.
We have a question over here.
Yes, excuse me. Burt Hill, Golden Gate Bridge District Board of Directors, and in my professional life in San Francisco, I chair the Bicycle Advisory Committee, and we're changing our name to a Mobility Committee as part of the process of change. I've observed in San Francisco in my 46 years there that I think our major problem here is my generation. The baby boomer generation, who, to borrow a metaphor from the NRA, will die when their cold dead fingers leave the steering wheel. In housing policy, they're the major objections to any kind of modification for affordable housing. What can you do? What can we do to try to move this generation? Normally we just wait until they die, but we need to make these changes much before we die off. So what can we do to turn that outlook forward instead of backward to help the education? They're not going to go to city college, or community colleges. So what can you do to help that process forward?
Wow. I mean, I'll start by saying we've actually been encouraging more senior employees to continue to work because of the 3.7% unemployment that we have. So a lot of our businesses are actually maybe more encouraging is try a different career path, maybe as you get older in life. But we still want, there's still a lot of good skill sets there for older Americans, so we don't want to totally lose that. At the same time, we obviously, we have a demographic issue, right? We all know this is coming. Almost 2/3 of our population now is in the baby boomer generation. Some of them are dying while they're working, but many of them are retiring. And so, how do we, we have this problem with Social Security, the whole entitlement issue, because we used to have 3 workers for every 1 person retiring. Now we have 1 worker for 7 people retiring. I think I heard the number, 10,000 baby boomers retire every day. So I don't have an easy answer to your question, except to say, perhaps encouraging folks to change something as they get older so they don't have to do the same job for 50 years. You can tell you this younger generation, that they're not wedded to any company or any job, so they're willing to bounce around. I think Robin touched on it earlier. Mobility is going to be key. And so maybe encouraging those types of behaviors, but I don't see any short-term solution to what you're raising there.
And I can speak for the manufacturing sector. We're holding on to as many workers as we can, including the older generation, and there's a lot of great opportunity to change skills, and our employers are very supportive of that. I think the one similarity that we also have, I don't know if this is shifting gears a little bit, but we often look at issues, especially in technology and innovation, as tomorrow problems. And not today. And I think that's a commonality in that our members will look at like blockchain technologies. No, I'm not investing in this today, but maybe in 2 or 3 years. And so I think to accelerate some of those adaptations is going to be very important for the success of manufacturing in the future.
And I will say as well, from a tech standpoint, I think there's sometimes this misnomer that millennials are the only ones using tech. And right. I mean, in some cases, they're the first adopters. But I think by and large, we really see, we're all doing things differently today. We all get more physical, or we all get more email than physical mail, right? We all turn to our phones when we need to know what's happening in the world, things like that. And I think it's a question we often get from the banking side. You're asking me to develop all these expensive apps, things like that, but millennials aren't profitable customers yet. But I think the answer is really everyone's using these new technologies. And I think tech can really be an enabler to bring older generations in as well. I was talking to a colleague recently who bought their father an Alexa, right? And this is someone who's never used technology before. He refuses to use a smartphone, things like that, but he's there chatting with Alexa all day. And so I think that in a lot of ways, technology can be used, and as we start developing more and more technologies and it becomes more intuitive, it becomes not just for generations, but for different groups that maybe had less access to it growing up, it becomes more user-friendly. We can all remember the days when you used to have a computer science degree to operate a computer. Today, anyone can do it. And I think as technology moves forward, that gap will also narrow.
Let's say 7% of our students are have a bachelor's degree or higher. So a lot of people come to the community college to reskill, to upskill, to change skills. So we're doing our best to bring y'all up to date.
But I think this clash between the physical world and the virtual world is definitely something that is going to continue to change things around us every day.
All right, well, here's the point where I get the chance to ask the question that I've been wanting to ask, and that is, all right, get out your crystal ball. We're going to have to do some crystal ball gazing here. What is it you're seeing within your own industries and perhaps what you would consider the market leaders within your industries? What are they doing to get ready for the future? Where do they see the opportunities that lie ahead?
I'll start. I mean, I think that investment in research and development is so important, and it continues to grow in the United States. And Ed earlier mentioned tax reform, and that freed up a lot of capital for employers across all sectors to invest in their workforces, to put more investment into R&D. And companies that aren't investing in R&D are going to struggle on innovation. And I think there are some great sectors that you all can look at sort of as you want to think about the future. Look at aerospace, which continuously has to innovate in order to survive. Automotive, we all know what's happening in the automotive sector. And also pharmaceuticals. Even though drug prices are certainly a hot topic right now, the pharmaceutical industry is doing more than ever to save lives and to keep people out of hospitals, which also add to expenses for business. And also it's not great to be in a hospital for personal health. But I think, you got to look at, I think, so those three sectors are good examples of industries that innovate to thrive and survive.
Yep. I would agree exactly with Robin said, except, one is producing the product, and then two is getting that workforce. I think it's really critical for the American business community to figure out ways to attract the folks that have the high-skilled jobs in working with our community colleges and other educational folks, apprenticeship programs. And that's really where I see public transit come in. Again, these millennials, I know when I was 16, getting a driver's license was a rite of passage. Now kids don't want a driver's license. And so communities that are able to figure that out and figure out how to provide options, those are where those people are going to go. That's where American businesses are going to go, those communities that are able to figure that out. So one is the product side, but two is getting the employees. And automation and technology will help there somewhat, but we still, at the end of the day, we need human beings to do a lot of this stuff. And those communities that are able to figure that out are going to be the ones successful. The ones that are not, they're going to have really difficult economic times moving forward.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, as part of our internal efforts to scope innovation and look at our role, we did a lot of looking at industry leaders. And what we noticed is in the banking side, all of the sort of leaders in the space were really doing three things. That one or two or all of these three was building out an innovation lab to look at how new technologies are interacting with their product and build out the products and services that are actually going to go into play at the bank or any organization. The second was actually participating in incubators, looking at the earliest stages of startups, what they're doing, what new ideas are bubbling up from the ecosystem, and bringing your business problems to those startups. So you have really bright individuals who want to start companies looking at solving your problems, not solving the problems they perceive you to have. And then the last I'll say is similar. It's investing in some of these new ideas, whether through venture capital arms or targeted investments. And these types of things give you really good access to what bright minds in the industry are thinking, what people who want to change the industry are thinking, but can also be scary, right? Not everyone has the resources to go build out all three of these things, and that's certainly something we see in banking. The average bank in the US, it surprises a lot of people, has 44 employees. So most banks don't have the scale to do this type of thing, and that's one thing we've decided that is a role we can play as a trade association, is helping build sort of strength in numbers. How do we bring those 5,000 banks in the US that don't have the ability to do this on their own together to give them access to some of those types of resources and learnings from what's happening in the startup side?
So I would agree with, obviously, what some of the group has said. So a couple points we haven't touched on as much. One is just looking abroad at what's happening specifically in some Asian countries, in China, maybe even more specifically in terms of technology adoption, just consumer behavior around products and services. For us, they're in some ways light years ahead of us from the retail standpoint. So that's something we didn't talk a lot about today, that just always an eye abroad in terms of the trends that may hit us, either based on how our demographics change or how population continues to change. There's a lot of data numbers around 2030 being a big date. Wharton has a lot actually of data around this, of like how different the entire world is going to be by 2030, and specifically in the US. So I'd encourage you to kind of just Google that and look into what Wharton is saying. It's kind of interesting. The other that we have all touched on is around data, and the companies that are not innovating, the companies that are not looking at workforce. I mean, if there's one other thing, it's just how are you analyzing data? How is regulation going to impact us in terms of data? So to be able to stay on top of it is, at some point, we can't wait to see what the consumer does in retail. We have to kind of know ahead, and I think the data will be a part of that. So making it kind of a simple thought is when you see a product recommendation on a retail website or a recommendation in store, like that's powered by data, and that needs to get better for our industry if we want to stay ahead. For the manufacturing side, if we want to produce the right products, to get it to the right people from the supply chain element. So looking abroad in data are kind of the things that scare me and excite me the most for retail.
I think we have to figure out how to break out of our silos. We have to stop doing things the same way we've always done them, just because we've always done them that way, which is really, really difficult to do. But I think we have to really pay attention to the next generation. and the generation after that, and look at this gig economy. For us in community colleges, we're based upon, the way colleges and universities have been set up since the dawn of the United States. And that's a really difficult thing to change. But we have to, because our students are going to demand it. Our technology partners are going to demand it. Our manufacturing partners are going to demand it because they're going to be changing themselves. So those are the things that I look to and constantly bring back to our team is really looking ahead at the next and the next and the next generation.
So let me ask a follow-on question. Is there a question here? Yes.
Thank you so much for the diversity you brought to the table today, and just listening to the conversations and all of the nuances that you have in your own organization, your own line of business and structure. It's just amazing to see how you're tying those things together and ultimately partnering in order to think about what is going to advance our communities as we move forward. One of the questions that I have in regards to that is how we see transportation from a busing standpoint. We recognize there are jobs that are there where we have no people that will meet the demands of those jobs, and then we also work with the education in order to make sure they have the skills. But what I've learned recently in the mentorship program with some of the college students is that they will interview for a position and they will not have a car, and they probably will not purchase a car, and they will say, well, I'm going to use public transportation, and then to be told that is not a reliable sense of a reliable mode of transportation in order to be employed at my place of business. So as you think about things, as you move forward and you're creating ideas for our future and what that entails, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because that was quite alarming to me that our students are being told that the form of public transportation that we have today will not suffice in order to eventually get where you need to go. Now, being from Hillsborough County, Heart Board, we did get our referendum, so we are going to work together in order to make sure we know where to go and when to do that. But that is heavy on my mind as we think about what we can do for our millennials and others as we move forward. Thank you for your consideration to the question.
Good question. Anybody?
I think personally, I have an 18-year-old nephew who not only, I was going to give him a car, for crying out loud, and he still hasn't gotten his license. So, I hear you. I don't understand it myself. I too, is 16 years old. It was.
They'd rather spend their money on other things.
Yeah, they really would.
They don't see a car as a good use of money.
And too much to my dismay, he's also chosen not to go to college. So he now lives in his mom's basement so he can walk to the grocery store to go to work every day. And that's what he wants to do for now. I have no doubt he'll change his mind in a couple of years. But I think in terms of your question, though, public transportation in general, I know that's really important for our students. We do serve the majority of, I think I said this before, minority, underrepresented, and first-generation college students in the United States. Public transportation, for a lot of them, is the only way they are able to even get to campus to get their registration done or buy their books or however they're going to do that. So that's something that I know we in our field tend to work directly with the agencies in the local communities, but also in terms of training them. There are a lot of commercial driver's license and those types of programs at our colleges. So I think, I do see that. But the number one thing that we hear from our business partners that work in industry are the lack of soft skills, the lack of how to be an adult. How do you get from point A to point B? How do you get to work every day? How do you know how to shop for the best dry cleaner so you can get your interview suit done? These students don't know, or they're not students, they're candidates at this point, don't know how to answer the phone correctly because they've been texting their whole life. They don't know how to send an email properly because they've been texting their whole life. So this is something that I know the folks in community colleges work on what we call wraparound skills, so that there's it's not just a matter of getting your certificate, getting your commercial driver's license, learning how to be a slot machine repairman for these programs, but there's also how to have a job interview, how to open up your bank account, how to do these kind of soft skill things that are just lost in the process. They're not taught at high school, they're not taught at college, and that's what we're doing. I don't know if it's enough, but that's the number one thing we hear from outside.
Yeah, just one quick comment on that. I think it's been said a lot today, but the importance of sort of that consistency and transparency more than really like the speed of service, things like that. Taking an example from the retail side, I think one of the really big value adds that Amazon does with sort of the 2-day shipping wasn't the fact that it wasn't necessarily 2 days, you could get that before, but it was the transparency. Here's where your package is, here's exactly when it'll get there. And I don't know about you when I'm waiting for a package, it's fine. If you tell me it's going to be there in 3 days, I probably won't be that upset, but it's when you tell me it'll be somewhere between 2 to 10 days. Or if you're waiting for the contractor and they'll get there sometime between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., that's when you get frustrated with things like this, and that's when you move away from services. Even if it's going to be an inconvenient time of the day, let's say the contractor, right, I can only come at 1 p.m. If I know and I can plan around that, I think that makes it a lot more usable.
So, sorry, one other just quick point. We're seeing on the retail side and the tech side a little bit of change, because for many of the larger organizations, headquarters are based like far out of city centers. We're seeing a lot of groups, even with an established, so in the Chicago area, forgive me, I'm not from Chicago, but there is quite a lot of retail in that area, based out of the city up to 45 minutes away on a good traffic day. There are city centers for those same organizations being built in central downtown Chicago to be able to attract more talent. And retail is, I believe, I don't want to say they're following the tech industry in this, but I believe it's more of a response to what the tech industry does, even for a brand like Walmart having major operations built in San Francisco and New York versus just in Bentonville, Arkansas. So I'm very sad also to hear that was the response that you got. I hear a lot more of the soft skill issues on our side, but we're seeing a move to be able to, react to that, to actually get to more talent in cities, and kind of that opposite thing, even partnering with organizations to make transportation easier, to adapt to kind of not just the millennials, but starting to think about that next generation coming through. So and you saw a part of Amazon's decision, right, for their organizations, was built on
Absolutely. Just to make that plug, no surprise that they centered on 2 metropolitan areas. They've got extensive transit networks, notwithstanding the fact that they're challenged right now with reliability, Ed, as you pointed out. But they recognize the importance of being able to provide great access via transit to their employee base in order to attract people and to keep them. So I think part of the message, not just to Tampa and Hillsborough, which is great news on the ballot measure, I think it's a signal really. Our communities need to build out as much of a transit network as possible. It's an issue of supply. If you've got good quality supply of transit, you've got a great opportunity to attract people. When we don't have that enough in abundance, then our ability to make that attraction is diminished. So, all right, Adelie, you've got a question?
Yes. My name is Adelie LeGrand. I work for TransDev, and I serve as the Chief Strategy Officer at the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. First, I want to state that I represent the missing or forgotten generation. I'm a part of the Generation X cohort. Who still
that
exists.
would be the greatest generation?
Yes, we get forgotten in like every single conversation about generations and the impact on where we are. So I really want to talk a little bit about the fact that I've had probably 8 different jobs. And I'm not 50, and I consider that probably over the next 20 years, I'll probably have a handful of additional jobs. So this is not new to our cohort. But I think as far as we talk about the disruptions and how we're moving forward, I'd like to hear from the panelists on what the impact of people changing jobs frequently has had, and how do you, I guess, project the impact will be moving forward, coupled with the changing demographics? How is that, with multiple job shifts, impacting the way you see yourselves moving forward in your organizations?
I think that's what I was touching on with the gig economy and the next generation and the next generation. They vote with their feet. For us, it means they're going to take a class at a time and a class at a time, and then go work for a while, and then maybe come back later and take another class. And so we're focused right now heavily on completion and graduation, and that's not going to work for this next generation of students, because they don't necessarily see obtaining a certificate or a degree as their end goal, right? Their goal is to get that next job. So they're going to change jobs. I think they said an average of 30 times in their career. So for us, it's great. We need to adapt our curriculum slightly, but they can keep coming back and reskilling as many times as they'd like to. But I'd venture to say it's going to be a little more interesting for my counterparts here.
Yeah, happy to take a swing at that, and I'll start out by, as the token millennial, I've only ever had one job, so I may be the wrong person to answer this. I've been at the ABA since I graduated undergrad, but I think some of it is looking at how work is changing today, and where having a diverse background and a diverse set of jobs may better prepare you in sort of that knowledge-based economy where people are. It's not one skill that you've learned that you've perfected, it's the ability to translate those skills and interpret data and do different things. So I think as people move from job to job, you learn something different at each one, and that in and of itself can help prepare you better for the next job.
And I think, again, that mobility in workforce and being a messenger, I think, on that is really important. And in manufacturing, jobs do change. There are things called layoffs, and people have to be able to acclimate to that kind of big change. And for some, those are seismic shifts and difficult to take. But again, if we're upfront and honest that you have a skill that's transferable, you will find a job, maybe not in the same county, but somewhere else. And I think I mentioned the pharmaceutical sector earlier. I was talking to some chemists at one particular company, and they're like, yeah, we work at 5 different companies in our careers, and we love that, and it's embraced by our sector because we bring something from one employer to the next, and then we innovate, and that's just how we grow and do our business. And I thought that was really great to hear, and I think we've got to be able to do some of that in other sectors.
Well, we are out of time. This has been a great discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists.